Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is Magic from Zero. Today I'll be talking about combat. A lot of trading card games have something similar to combat, where you use your creatures to launch an attack against your opponent, and they have to use their creatures to defend somehow. Each game handles things a little bit differently though, so if you're coming to Magic from another TCG, a lot of this will probably seem familiar, and the principal difficulty is going to be keeping track of what specific differences there are between Magic's combat system and the one that you're used to. On the other hand, if you don't have experience with combat from another TCG, that's fine too, because I'll be going through all the steps and talking about how everything works in detail. Ready? Let's get started. So, because there is going to be a lot to keep track of, I'll start by giving a broad strokes overview and then explain more about each part in the process in turn. In Magic, you can only attack during your turn. You can attack with any number of creatures, but there's only one attack per turn, so you have to declare all your attackers at the same time. You cannot direct an attack against a specific creature that your opponent controls. Rather, your opponent gets to decide which of their creatures, if any, will be assigned to block each attacker. After blockers are declared, the attacking and blocking creatures deal combat damage at the same time, and then any creatures that have taken sufficient damage go to their owner's graveyard. So that's the general process. Being an introduction, what I said is, of course, simplified a bit, and on top of that, there's a lot of common abilities of creatures that they can have that lets them break some of the rules that I just mentioned. But that short summary is enough to get you through probably about 90% of combats that you'll encounter in actual games. So keep that in mind if you find yourself getting overwhelmed when I start going into the details for everything. Now, if you remember earlier in this series when I was talking about how Magic turns are structured, you might recall that combat happens in the very middle of the turn, with a main phase before and after it. Actually, originally combat was considered just part of the main phase, and attacking was just one more thing in the list of game actions that you could take then. Over time, as the game grew, combat became more and more significant, and so it was broken out into its own phase to make it easier for rules and card effects to concisely refer to it. The combat phase in Magic is broken up into 5 steps. Beginning with combat, declare attackers, declare blockers, combat damage, and end of combat. The general pattern is that in each step, you first do any game actions associated with that step, then players get a chance to cast spells, and when no one wants to cast anymore, the game moves on to the next step. Recall that most spells need to be played during your main phase. Only instants can be played at other times, so the beginning of combat and end of combat steps are there mostly so that players can have a chance to play instants during combat, such that no other spells can be played, but before or after all the action of the actual combat phase. Those steps don't have any specific game actions associated with them, but the other 3 do. Fortunately, it shouldn't be hard to remember the proper order because declaring attackers, declaring blockers, and combat damage is really the only order that those 3 make sense. Well, now let's talk about the individual steps. During the declare attackers, well, declaring attackers sounds like it would be pretty self-explanatory, and most of the time it is, but like casting a spell, there's a defined process for it, and also like casting a spell, most of the steps in that process are only relevant if something unusual happens that makes the specific order matter for something. If you asked most players what the process looks like, they would probably just say that you pick which creatures are attacking and say what they're attacking against, and then those creatures become tapped. And that's literally all you need to know for 95% of combats, but there are a couple of subtleties that I'll go over for completeness. First, you choose which creatures are attacking. Now, only creatures can attack, which means that anything that you want to attack with needs to be a creature by this point. Now, if that sounds obvious to you and you're wondering why I'm even making a big deal about this, have a look at this Mutavault. It's a land, but as you can see, it has an ability that turns it into a creature. Sometimes people will attack with some creatures, animate a Mutavault, and then attack with it. Depending on how laid back everyone in the game is, they might let this fly, but officially, you need to declare all of your attackers at the same time, which means that if Mutavault is not a creature at the time you start declaring your attackers, technically you wouldn't be able to attack with it. By the way, Mutavault is not unique. There are a lot of lands that can turn into creatures. The first one was printed all the way back in 1994, and there have been several others throughout the year. If you hear someone use the term manland, this is what they're talking about. Artifacts that can turn into creatures also show up regularly. For example, vehicles are a special type of artifacts that can be crewed by creatures. This Iron Tread Crusher is normally just an artifact, but if you tap 3 power worth of other creatures, it will become a creature itself so that you could attack with it. The next stipulation is that only untapped creatures can attack. This Archivist has an ability that lets you tap it to draw a card. If you used that ability earlier in the turn, you would not be able to attack with Archivist because it would be tapped. Similarly, it is not possible to attack with a creature that you already tapped to crew a vehicle, nor could you attack with a Mutavault if you had already tapped it for mana. The reason for this is that flavorfully tapping in some sense represents using a card in a way that can only be done once per turn. If you already used it once for something else, you can't use it for something different later. This point and the previous one apply to blocking too, by the way. You can only block with a creature, and the creature needs to be untapped in order to block. Now, this is not true for the next point, which is the summoning sickness rule. If you watched my previous videos in the series, you may recall that there's a rule saying you cannot attack with a creature unless you've controlled it continuously since the turn began. Now, this is called the summoning sickness rule, and it exists as a way to give players a turn to react to a creature being played before they're under threat from it. Originally, this was justified flavorfully as creatures needing some time to acclimate to a new plane after being summoned. Now, these days, you don't hear that term used as much, but the rule is still there. This one only applies to attacking creatures. You can block with any creature regardless of how long you've controlled it. After you've decided which creatures you're attacking with, you have to decide what they're attacking. In the earliest days of Magic, this was only relevant if you were playing a game that had more than one opponent, and you had to decide which player each creature was attacking against. Remember how I said that you can't attack a creature of your opponent's directly the way that you can in some other games? Well, there are certain types of other cards that a player can control that you can directly attack. I'll talk more about Planeswalkers and battles in a future video in this series, but for now, just know that it is possible to attack those types of cards, and if you do, your opponent is still considered to be the defending player for the purposes of abilities like this Agate Blade Assassin, even though you're not attacking a player in that case. After proposing a set of attacking creatures, the next step is for the game to check to see if that set is legal. Sometimes cards will have abilities that require them to attack in a certain way or restrict them from attacking somehow. A proposed set of attackers is only legal if it complies with all the restrictions and obeys the maximum possible number of requirements. If the set fails this check, the game goes all the way back to the beginning of the process and starts over. This is true if any problems come up anywhere during the declaration of attackers, but this is the spot where it's the most likely to happen. After the game approves of the proposed set of attacking creatures, those creatures all become tapped. Sometimes cards will have an ability that imposes a cost to attack. In that case, the total cost is determined and paid at this time, and after all of that, every creature that was declared as an attacker is officially considered to be an attacking creature. Any abilities that trigger on attack will trigger at this time. In addition, after this point, the game won't care if something adds a restriction or a cost that might affect one of the attackers. For example, if you cast this off balance against a creature that had already been declared as an attacker, that wouldn't do anything. If you wanted to cast a spell like this and have it work properly, you would need to cast it before the spot in the process of declaring attackers where restrictions were checked. The last chance a player would have to do that would be during the beginning of combat step. Once the process of declaring attackers starts, no player gets a chance to cast spells until after it's completed. The same sort of logic holds with declaring blockers too. If the blockers were legal at the time when they were declared, the game won't go back and fix things if they become illegal later on. Now, that was a pretty deep explanation, but would you believe it's not even everything? If you're interested, I made a whole video just on the topic of declaring attackers, so you can check that out if you'd like a more advanced treatment. But this is enough for any situation that's likely to come up in normal gameplay, as opposed to some sort of a contrived example that was made up to stump a judge. After declaring attackers, each player gets a chance to cast spells before the game moves on to the declare blocker step. Declaring blockers follows a very similar process with appropriate modifications. The defending player first says which of their creatures will block and which attacking creature each one is blocking. In Magic, it is legal for 2 or more blockers to be assigned to the same attacking creature, but it isn't normally possible for any individual creature to be assigned to block more than one attacker. After declaring blockers, the game also checks for legality, and then any costs to block are evaluated and paid, and after all that, the creatures that were declared as blockers are officially considered blocking creatures. Note that although the summoning sickness rule does not apply to blockers, the rule about needing to be untapped still does. And that said, blocking does not cause a creature to become tapped the way attacking does, and if a creature somehow becomes tapped after being declared as a blocker, that doesn't affect anything at all. Once blockers are declared, the game again gives players a chance to cast spells before moving on to the next step, combat damage. Each attacking and blocking creature will deal damage equal to its power, the first number in the bottom right corner. Blocking creatures deal this damage to the creature that they're blocking, and attacking creatures will either deal this damage to the creature blocking them or whatever they were attacking if they're unblocked. A creature that's dealt damage greater than its toughness, the second number, will die and be put into its owner's graveyard. A player dealt damage this way loses that much life, and if a creature is attacking a planeswalker or battle, that many counters are removed from that card instead. If the thing that a creature would deal damage to is no longer around to take that damage, for example, if it got hit by a removal spell, no damage is dealt. One very important consequence of this rule is that playing a removal spell against a blocker does not allow an attacking creature to deal damage to whatever it was attacking. Rather, it just means that attacker will not deal any damage this turn. Sometimes it'll come up that one of the players needs to decide how a creature's damage is dealt. Officially, the attacking player says how they're assigning the damage first, and then the defending player makes that decision afterwards. There's two common ways that this situation can come up. First, maybe one attacking creature is blocked by two or more of the opponent's creatures. In this case, the attacking creature's controller would need to decide how to divide that creature's damage among the two creatures that are blocking it. Now, this is a totally free choice. Any division where the total amount of damage equals the attacking creature's power is possible. This is a change from previous rules, so you might hear some more experienced players refer to a damage assignment order, which is how these situations used to be handled. But this is no longer applicable. If it happens that some creature manages to block multiple attacking creatures, well, this works exactly the same, with that creature's controller deciding how the blocking creature's damage will be divided among the creatures that it is blocking. The second common way that a player might need to make a decision regarding how damage is dealt is an ability called Trample. You might remember from an earlier video in this series that Trample is an example of what's called a keyworded ability, an ability that's so commonly used on cards that it has a special key word or phrase to represent it. Because combat is such an important part of Magic, many keyworded abilities are related to various aspects of combat. For example, Haste allows a creature to ignore the Summoning Sickness rule. Vigilance means a creature doesn't have to tap to attack. Flying is an evasion ability, which means it restricts what kind of creatures can block an attacker with this ability. In the future, I'll have a full episode talking about various common keywords like these, but this seemed like a good time to introduce a couple of the combat-centric ones. If you were paying attention when I was talking about combat damage, how it worked, you might have noticed something kind of interesting. If an attacking creature gets blocked, all of its damage goes against the blocker. This leads to situations where a player might block a very large creature with a small one to save damage, colloquially referred to as chump blocking. The blocker would be sacrificed, but it might be worth it because you don't lose any life. Trample is an ability that lets an attacking creature avoid wasting damage in such a scenario. If an attacking creature has Trample, they can decide to put any amount of excess damage to the thing that they're attacking after assigning lethal damage to all the creatures that were blocking it. Another combat-related ability is called First Strike. As you can see, creatures with First Strike deal their combat damage before creatures without First Strike. Now, the way this officially works is that if any creatures with First Strike are attacking or blocking, the game actually has two combat damage steps, one right after the other. In the first step, only creatures with the First Strike ability assign and deal their damage. In the second, all the other creatures get to deal their damage, if they survived. Creatures that were lethally damaged during the first combat damage step will not be around to deal damage back during the second one. There is also an ability called Double Strike, which means you could deal damage in both steps. Okay, today we've covered the structure of the combat phase, how attacking, blocking, and combat damage work, and gone over some of the keyword abilities that are related to combat. Let's cool down with a few challenge questions to test your understanding. First, Amy taps Archivist to draw a card. Then, she plays a Cloud Shift on it. Because the default is that a card enters the battlefield untapped unless the effect says otherwise, this means her Archivist is now untapped. Can she attack with it this turn? And the answer is no. Remember, the Summoning Sickness rule says that you cannot attack with a creature unless you've controlled it continuously since the start of the turn. Even the momentary blink of existence of this creature on the battlefield during the resolution of Cloud Shift is enough to fail that check. Notice that this trick would work if Amy wanted to block with the Archivist, though, since the Summoning Sickness rule does not apply to blockers. There's even a chance to cast spells during the Declare Attackers step. Now, this is in between declaring attackers and declaring blockers, so you could cast the Cloud Shift here to catch your opponent off guard with a surprise blocker. Okay, next we'll say that Amy attacks with a 1/1 creature and Nick blocks it with a 4/4. Could Amy save her creature by playing a Fit of Rage on it? And the answer is no. The reason is that Fit of Rage is a sorcery, which means you can only play this spell during your main phase, not during combat. But let's imagine instead that Amy has a Sure Strike. This is an instant, so Amy could play it just fine. But let's think about specifically when she should do that. What step of the combat phase should Amy cast this spell? Well, right out of the gate, we can say the combat damage step is out. Recall that the first thing that happens in this step is that combat damage is assigned and dealt. The first chance Amy would have to cast a spell in this step is therefore too late to save her creature. She needs to cast it during the Declare Blocker step. If she does this play, then as the game progresses from the Declare Blocker step to the combat damage step, it will see that there's a creature with the first strike ability, meaning there's an extra combat damage step this turn for the first strike creatures to deal their damage. Amy's creature will deal 4 damage to Nick's blocker during this step, and Nick's blocker will then die since it's taken damage equal to its toughness. In the second combat damage step, any other attacking and blocking creatures that didn't deal damage in the first strike step will get to deal their combat damage. Nick's 4/4 is no longer in play though, meaning it will not be dealing any damage this combat. We can see now why this trick would not work if Amy tried to cast the Sure Strike during the Declare Attacker step. Nick isn't stupid. He knows what's going to happen if he blocks a 4/1 first striker with his 4/4. It's very unlikely he would make this play if Amy casts the Sure Strike too early. She needs to wait until after Nick commits his blockers to deploy her combat trick. As you can see, casting your spells at the right time is key to optimizing how much value you get out of them, and understanding how combat works is important in evaluating when the right time is. Next up, Amy controls 2 Mog flunkies. Can she attack with both of them and no other creatures? And the answer is yes. In Magic, you don't declare an attack with each creature one at a time the way you do in some other card games. Rather, you say which creatures that you want to attack with, and then that entire set is evaluated for legality. If your proposed set of attackers includes 2 creatures, then you are not attacking alone with either of them, which means the restriction imposed by Mog Flunky's ability is not going to stop you from doing this. Alright, last question. Can you attack with both Kalsisma Behemoth and Llanowar Elves, and use the elves to help pay the 2 mana it costs for Kalsisma Behemoth to attack? Okay, so to answer this, we'll need to remember the steps for declaring attackers. The very last step is to pay the cost to attack, which is after the time when all the attacking creatures get tapped. There's no way to tap the Llanowar Elves for mana after declaring it as an attacker, but before the game taps it, so this trick doesn't work. If you wanted to do the same thing as a blocker, though, that would be fine. Blocking does not cause the creatures to tap, so after you declared both these creatures as blockers, you could tap the Llanowar Elves for mana and use it to pay the Kalsisma Behemoth's cost to attack. Being tapped would not affect the Llanowar Elves' ability to block at all. If Amy had a Steward of Valoron and she wanted to attack with it and Kalsisma Behemoth, that would work too, because the Steward has Vigilance, it does not tap to attack, meaning that it will still be untapped when the time comes to pay the 2 mana. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.